A number of years ago, when I was a very new minister, I think it was actually my first or second year as an ordained minister, I was co-officiating at a memorial service. As is often done in Unitarian Universalist congregations, the guests are invited to share a reflection about the deceased. This is not without its risks. On this particular afternoon, after a number of people had spoken, a man approached the podium and began speaking. I didn't know the man, but thankfully my co-officiant did. After about 5 minutes, my colleague speaks rather loudly, I thought, from her seat and says, "Bob, now would be an appropriate time to say something about the deceased." The man would clearly be eligible for an "It's All About Me" award. And I assure you they don't teach you how to respond to these situations in seminary. My sermon this Sunday is somewhat of an "it's all about me" experience, and then perhaps all sermons are. Over the past few years, there have been recurring themes in my reading and personal reflection time. And this morning I will offer you a snapshot of my current understanding of some of the most significant challenges I face, and perhaps you as well, in our shared human experience. That recurring theme is that I often make snap judgments of others or of situations that may then lead me, without much forethought, to say something, giving voice to my own disapproval or judgment in a situation. The flip side, of course, is that of my own making, I can feel judged by others in turn, and this has led to feelings of resentment and irritation and even alienation. In my reading, I've been drawn to Eastern religions in an attempt to understand the self. More specifically, I've tried to understand my attachments that have led to my own suffering, my own uneasiness. In other words, when I get in a difficult situation, I try to figure out how, consciously or unconsciously, my own attachments have led me to judgments, to judgmental thoughts or words. Now, Eastern religions often speak of a misunderstanding of the self, contributing to our own suffering. As a remedy, many Eastern religions speak about the non-self, even to the extent of claiming that there is no self and that any belief in the self is an illusion. I understand this motivation, this teaching. I understand our interrelatedness, and I understand our impermanence in our beings. But I stop short at the claim that there is no self. I recently had a conversation with my colleague and mentor, the Reverend Roy Reynolds, and he spoke quite well to my dilemma. What I understood Roy to say is that Western culture and religion seem to speak all about the self, and Eastern culture and religion seem to speak all about the non-self. Roy continued to say that both Eastern and Western religion have something to offer, and that drawing from both, we can at the same time appreciate the self and be skillful in avoiding the many traps that seem to ensnare us. To lift up my own Western heritage, I understand and celebrate the value of accomplishment, of my own sense of identity and self-worth, of personal responsibility, and my own ability to solve problems and contribute to society. I also understand that making quick decisions or judgments is a contributing factor to the survival of any species. And while snap judgments can get me in trouble, I place great value on discernment, which I suppose is a softer, gentler way of making judgments. And I believe in the inherent worth and dignity of each person, that this is based on a positive understanding of the self. The existence of self became quite evident to me this past week when I found a menacing-looking insect in the bathroom at our home. As the large insect was moving toward me, my sense of self tried to discourage it and to move it in another direction. Unfortunately, when the insect disappeared from my view, meaning it had either moved far away or perhaps it had found its way underneath my clothing, my understanding of self became quite enlivened. I knew exactly what myself was, and I had no interest in sharing that with the insect. In my enlivened state, I managed to quickly divest myself of all my clothes, and it was only then that I realized, thankfully, that myself and the insect self had not become one. Of course, there was now a large pile of clothes in the middle of the bathroom. I was naked, and I wondered if the large menacing insect had taken residence there in the pile of clothes. I won't bore you with the details, but the story did have a happy ending. I eventually found the insect and dutifully escorted it out of my home. And of course, Carol, my wife, watched part of this and found it all quite amusing, if not disturbing, wondering if I was losing my mind. I later assured her I wasn't losing my mind, I was simply having a religious experience. I tell you this story because as I was dancing with this menacing insect, I was very clear that myself and the insect's self were quite distinct and they needed to stay that way. It is, of course, the case that this sense of self can run amok. It would perhaps be appropriate to mention here that I'm using this sense of self and the ego interchangeably. It is possible to have a healthy sense of self, a healthy ego. But we are also aware in our society that the sense of self and the ego can get out of control. One can become so infatuated with accomplishment, with personal gain, that one can lose all sense of perspective and interrelatedness. Performing enhancing drugs in sports, political or business ambition intended to distort the truth and crush opponents, deception and fraud in order to build wealth or reputation, gang activity. These are just a few examples of a grossly elevated ego to the detriment of other values. It is here that fame or accumulation of wealth or power becomes end unto themselves, because the self, it seems, is all there is. And yet, between the ego that is healthy and that which is run amok, it seems to me that there is a third sense of ego that I call insidious. That is, it is subtly harmful, and it interferes with our meaningful relationships with others. This ego operates under many disguises. So what exactly am I talking about, this other sense of ego, this insidious sense of ego? As you may know, Carol and I have just celebrated 20 years of marriage. And during those 20 years, I have repeatedly learned and relearned the lesson of when simply to listen and appreciate her point of view. When I open my mouth inappropriately, I am usually operating at the behest of ego. Sometimes, I think there is something that Carol does not understand, and I just need to explain it to her one more time. Or I think there's something that Carol doesn't recognize about herself, and I just need to point it out to her. And of course, she'll be so grateful when I do. Or it may be that we have different points of view. I will share my perspective, and she has hers. And after she shares her perspective, I realize that she may not have heard me or understood me, so I need to repeat what I said earlier, or maybe say it a little differently, and then, of course, all will be well. It never ends that way. The ego is that part of me that needs to be right, that needs to be heard, that needs to be understood, that needs to show my depth of understanding, that has difficulty believing that we might both be right, that cannot let an insight go unstated. A healthy ego does not need any of these. A healthy ego has the self-confidence and the self-esteem such that it is okay not to be heard some of the time. It is okay not to be understood all the time. It's okay to be held in low esteem or even no esteem, rather than to assert one's own rightness in a situation. Shortly after choosing this topic, I found this reading in the book, The Song of the Bird. 123 short wisdom stories from all of the world's religions, collected by Father Anthony de Mello. And this is the reading that stuck with me. A girl in a fishing village became an unwed mother, and after several beatings, finally revealed who the father of the child was, the Zen master living on the outskirts of the village. The villagers trooped into the master's house, rudely disrupted his meditation, denounced him as a hypocrite, and told him to keep the baby. All the master said was, "Very well, very well." He picked up the baby and made arrangements for a woman from the village to feed and clothe and look after it at his expense. The master's name was ruined, and all his disciples abandoned him. When this had gone on for over a year, the girl who had borne the child could stand it no longer and finally confessed that she had lied. The father of the child was the boy next door. The villagers were most contrite. They prostrated themselves at the feet of the master to beg his pardon and to ask for the child back. The master returned the child, and all he said was, "Very well, very well." While this is a story in the extreme, it helps me understand how I have jumped to my own defense or felt the need to explain myself, and how this can lead to escalation in a conflict. It has been my experience that people are often not ready to hear the other side of the story. I have a second reading that is not a story, but is from the book The New Earth by Eckhart Tolle. It was his writing. It was this writing I'm about to share, and it's not a short reading. But it was this writing on the personal and the interpersonal nature of the ego that convinced me I needed to give this sermon. And I will offer it because I found myself, and perhaps you will find yourself in its descriptions. He begins, "Inner space also arises when you let go of the need to emphasize yourself. That need is of ego. It is not a true need. Whenever you relinquish one of these behavior patterns, inner space emerges. You become more truly yourself. To the ego, it will seem as if you are losing yourself. But the opposite is actually the case. Jesus already taught that you need to lose yourself in order to find yourself. Whenever you let go of these patterns, you become less so you can be more. Here are some ways in which people unconsciously try to emphasize themselves, their selves. If you are alert enough, writes Tolle, you may be able to detect some of these unconscious patterns within yourself. Demanding or secretly hoping for recognition for something that you did and getting angry or upset if you don't get it. Trying to get attention by talking about your problems, the story of your illnesses, or making a scene. Giving your opinion when nobody has asked for it and when it makes no difference to the situation. Being more concerned with how the other person sees you than with the other person. Which is to say, using other people for egoic, E-G-O-I-C. My spell checker doesn't recognize it, and neither do I. Egoic reflection, or as ego enhancers, says Tolle. trying to make an impression on others through possessions or knowledge or good looks or status, physical strength, who you know, and so on. Bringing about temporary ego inflation through angry reaction against something or someone. Taking things personally, being offended. Making yourself right and others wrong through futile mental or verbal complaining. Wanting to be seen or to appear important. Tolle continues, once you have detected a pattern within yourself, and I saw so many of my own patterns in that list, Tolle writes, I suggest that you conduct an experiment. Find out what it feels like and what happens if you let go of that pattern. Just drop it and see what happens. De-emphasizing who you are is another way of generating consciousness, he writes. Discover the enormous power that flows through you into the world when you stop emphasizing yourself. 3 weeks ago, I gave a sermon, Building the Vision, Emerson's Next Steps. I talked about Emerson being a radically, and Greg just said this so well, being a radically inclusive, open-minded, beloved community that is a vibrant source of peace, hope, and healing. And more specifically, on that Sunday, I spoke about sometime in the future, Emerson having a reputation in the community in areas such as anti-bullying, having respectful candidates forums here in our congregation, and being peaceful advocates for marriage equality in Cobb County. Cobb County needs us. These were just a few examples of how we could put our vision and our mission into practice. As I relate that sermon to this sermon, it occurs to me that having a reputation is not because we are out there promoting ourselves as this or that. It is not because we are making demands or making accusations or making ourselves known. It is not at the behest of ego or Emerson's ego. Building our vision will happen because we quietly do the work of our Unitarian Universalist values. In a similar spirit, in our relationships with ourselves and with others, the ego or the self is at its best when it quietly listens more than it speaks, when it does not insist on being right, or being heard, or having its way, or even being held in high esteem. As Unitarian Universalists, may we boldly and quietly, as paradoxical as that sounds, be about our mission and vision, not just in the work of the congregation, but in our individual lives as well. Because, as I said 3 weeks ago, that is the only true starting place, and all else follows. From committed individuals with a healthy sense of self and with peace in the heart. When we do that, the vision and the mission naturally follow. May it be so.